Good morning, everyone. My name is Erica Organsky, and I'm a volunteer on the Philly SHRM Program Committee. We want to thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Immigration Survival Guide, New Administration, New Adjudications, and Upcoming Regulations. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Elena Luttermauser, from the Graduate Assistant Director in the School of Business at Westchester University, our annual webinar sponsor. Alana?
Hi, everyone. My name is Elena. I'm the Graduate Assistant Director in the School of Business at Westchester, and I am here to share an exciting degree opportunity for you. It's the Masters of Science in Human Resource Management. It's an AACSB accredited, SHRM aligned. It's a top value and 100% online graduate program. Complete your entire human resource degree in a 100% online class format, part-time or full-time. This 30-credit, 10-course program operates in 7-week terms, and we offer 5 terms a year. Additionally, you can complete your classwork around your weekly schedule based on your work and family commitments. One 3-credit course is approximately $1,500. This means you can earn your entire degree for thousands less than at other comparable schools. The MS Human Resource Management program is AACSB accredited, and it's also SHRM aligned. Students that meet the prerequisites are eligible to sit for the SHRM Certification Professional exam in their final semester. Finally, the degree prepares you to advance within the human resource profession at the highest levels. The curriculum focuses on compensation and benefits, employee and labor relations, ethics, global human resources, human resource metrics, leadership and change management, and workforce planning. Regarding admission, if you qualify, you can skip the GMAT, and our students come from all kinds of educational and professional backgrounds, not just business. This was a very brief overview, so if you please have questions, I ask that you contact me at HRM at wcupa.edu. That's HRM at wcupa.edu. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Westchester University, for your sponsorship. During today's presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them via the question box on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will read them aloud to the speaker at the end of the webinar. We will also want to remind you that you are eligible to receive 1 HRCI credit and 1 SHRM Professional Development credit for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email after the webinar with a survey link that must be completed in order to receive the certificate for your credits. Once the survey has been completed, the credit forms will be emailed to you within 1 week. All slides will be sent to all attendees after the webinar. Today's webinar will feature Kristen Giamplo, Senior Counsel in Employment Law at Bristol Myers Squibb, Amy Nice, Immigration Policy Advisor and Consultant, and William Stock, Immigration Attorney and Partner at Glasgow Immigration Law Partners, LLP. Thank you all for joining us today.
And thank you, Lindsay, for that introduction, and for those who followed our rescheduling because of the Philadelphia celebration for the Eagles. It is wonderful to have you here after our President's Day weekend. So immigration is one of the hottest topics that has come out since President Trump's inauguration. We're now a little bit more than a year away from that. It's a good time to take a step back and to be clear about what has changed in the world of immigration, particularly when we talk about immigration that is talent acquisition related, so hiring individuals who do need visa sponsorship for the various kinds of visas that people are entitled to. And we're going to spend most of our time talking about those kinds of things. We'll also be talking a little bit about the new compliance environment and what employers need to be aware of in terms of compliance in the immigration space. Really, what we're trying to figure out is how can human resources help their organizations navigate a world where immigration seems to be in the headlines all the time. And so first, I'll start by turning it over to you, Amy. we keep hearing about, you turn on the news, let's build a wall, let's get rid of all the illegal immigrants, and in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of legislative activity around the DACA program for those kids who were brought to the United States as minors, and have already gone to school in the United States. Congress couldn't even seem to figure out a deal to protect those very sympathetic young folks. But I think all of that headline level noise really obscures where I think a lot of the actual changes are going to be put in place that are going to affect human resources and organizations on a day-to-day basis. And I know there's a saying where you live in Washington, D.C., that personnel is policy. So maybe you can help us understand the policies that organizations can expect by talking a little bit about the personnel that we're seeing in this administration.
Well, personnel is policy is probably particularly relevant for SHRM. I think one of the things that's a little unique about this administration, and you start with the premise that every administration obviously has political appointees, and in the immigration space, in any administration, probably the immigration policy, the people who hold senior decision-making positions in the immigration policy space know each other and might have generally aligned ideas about priorities. The thing that's really different about this administration is two things. One, you have a group of people that literally have worked side by side with each other for many years, who are now populated in senior positions, and they come with a very ideologically aligned and very specific goal, which is to reduce legal immigration. And we haven't had a group of decision makers in any administration that came from working to get all of them know each other and have a level of trust and interaction from their prior jobs at a very unusual level, and that they're particularly focused on this idea of reducing legal immigration. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples so that people can really get a feel for how this is different. The director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, besides being a longtime DHS staffer, spent the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years, as an immigration staffer on Senator Grassley's office. His chief of the Office of Policy and Strategy worked for Senator Grassley for 15 years before coming to USCIS. And that particular position, the Office of Policy and Strategy, OPNS, has been a position that since the Homeland Security Act has an extraordinary amount of power and control that has not actually been exercised by any of its incumbents. Now that we have somebody in that position that very much has an agenda, and she has worked hand in glove with her director, and has an incredible amount of say and input into any immigration-related policy. Then we have the chief of staff for the director, as well as the deputy general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security at DHS headquarters, both coming from the House Judiciary Committee Republican staff. Then we have the president's senior advisor on immigration at the Domestic Policy Council at the White House, coming from Sessions' office, and the former counselor to the DHS secretary for the first 10 months, and now counselor to the Attorney General, also coming from Sessions' office. And then the chief counsel for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is someone who has the same ideological bent. And so all of these people are working together, and they can pick up the phone and resolve things in minutes about or they listen to each other and rely on each other's views about what policies to make. And as you can see on the slide, a lot of the policies, procedures, data that is used, concepts, and starting point for discussion is coming from the Center for Immigration Studies in particular, and in some ways also FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. The person who's in charge of who's supposed to be the independent watchdog of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the Ombudsman's Office, is a former FAIR staffer. So Bill, I think the thing that is different about this administration is their particular focus on reducing legal immigration as their, not by any means possible, as their number one goal. And it's a shared ideology, and that these people have worked together very closely, specifically trying to advance those views already in their past history.
I want to just drill into that for a quick second, Amy. So and make sure people understand. I mean, a lot of the rhetoric, particularly in the Republican Party for years, has been about stopping illegal immigration, stopping people from crossing over the border without documentation, stopping people from overstaying their visas. But this is really sort of a rethinking of it. You mentioned a couple of senators, Senator Grassley from Iowa, Senator Sessions, who's now Attorney General, but who was the senator from Alabama. These are senators who proposed huge restrictions on the abilities of companies to use L1 visas, the ability of companies to use H1B visas, who've blocked any kind of increase in the number of H1Bs, even though there's a lot of demand for them every year, and we have this lottery. So are you seeing sort of a cultural shift in this administration that says, companies who use immigration programs are somehow going to be under more scrutiny in this administration?
Well, I would say that in past administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, the employer community would have an opportunity to have substantive meetings with policy decision makers. Those decision makers may not agree or may not care or may not be focused specifically on the needs or concerns of employers, but there would be real listening and real and an opportunity, however limited, to point out results, unintended consequences, business practices, in an effort to convince policy decision makers that some of the policies that were either being considered or had been implemented should be revised or direction changed. And I think, just as an example that's very telling, and to answer your question, Bill, I think that after the president issued the BAHA executive order, the Buy American, Hire American executive order, there was a meeting in the White House between all of these people that we were just talking about, the DHS headquarters, the USCIS leaders, and the Domestic Policy Council people. And there was a question about how much the White House really wanted to be involved in overseeing implementation at the policy level, which, as we go forward in this webinar, and as Christy gives some insights about how these actual policies impact the day-to-day work that HR professionals and others do, and Bill kind of guides us as to these different types of changes that are happening. When you're talking about at the policy level, how much does the White House want to be involved in reviewing what USCIS does with regard to focusing on the Hire American objective of the executive order? And the response from the White House was, anything that reduces legal immigration is good. So I think that kind of says it all, and does indicate that we're at a different place, at least for now, at least for, during this administration, with regard to what employers can expect.
Wow. Well, that's, I think, sort of a different environment than employers are used to dealing with. At a minimum, SHRM, I think, has very much been an actor in giving employers a seat at the table and a voice, and it seems like that's going to be really limited. Now, but let's, I guess, frame this appropriately in terms of, what can change and has to change. There's everything from a new law, which, boy, we haven't seen a new law in the legal immigration space since the early 2000s. But, a lot of the stuff we do day to day is actually not even something that Congress has to pass. So can you give us a little bit of a sense of sort of what the timing is that we can expect for this anti-immigration agenda to come through?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, Bill, Congress had a hard time last week, at least on the Senate side, having a real debate about the DACA, a solution for DACA. Now, some would say that the Trump administration put their finger on the scale because when a bipartisan solution was put forward that had 8 Republican senators and 8 Democratic senators, at the end of the day on February 14th, first thing in the morning, February 15th, DHS put out a scathing criticism of the bipartisan agreement, the bipartisan bill. And that also is unusual to have a department acting in a very political way as opposed to providing technical assistance or a technical response to regarding impact. So legislation is going to be tough, like you said, hasn't happened for a long time. I think the general sense in the immigration policy circles in Washington with regard to legislation is whatever happens with the DACA fix, whatever else is attached to that, whatever crazy negotiations or last minute enterprise reach, whatever last minute results occur, that is going to be the legislative enterprise for this year. And certainly that we are not expecting any further legislative efforts on immigration this year. That said, next Congress obviously is still under the Trump administration. Who knows? But it's very difficult and not something. It's something that people are working on, but it's not something that any company would be planning on responding to or making any business plans. Well, there's going to be a new law that's going to do X, Y, Z. Regulations in the immigration space, as Bill knows, is a very experienced practitioner, and Christy knows, as working in this area for so long, are few and far between. The Obama administration finalized a rule in 2016 that implemented a law that had been in place since the year 2000 that they had been implementing through policy guidance. So it takes regulations in the immigration space have traditionally taken a long time to mature. Like there's a thought process, they're working on it, then it eventually gets proposed. This administration has said that they're going to propose a number of regulations and go through.
Regulation.
Pardon?
I was just going to say, sorry, some things don't even take this sort of formal regulation process, right?
Right, and that was the third thing, sorry, just to wrap up, is that the regulatory process is formalized and can take 6 to 7 to 9 months after the time that it's first published before you see a final rule. But the real area where I'm looking at this administration having taken action and continuing to focus on is what I call the 3 Ps: policy, procedures, and practices. And some of these aren't even announced to stakeholders before they're implemented. And that's where this group of people who have a particular agenda, who work together and can sort of cut through some of the bureaucracy because they all agree and they're all on the same page and they have this very specific goal. These policies, procedures, and practices changes are things that can really have an impact on the day-to-day.
Okay, and we'll talk about some specific ones later, but boy, Christy, I want to get you involved in the conversation. You're within an organization now. HR comes to you and they said, okay, I'm in a panic attack because I was at this webinar and it seems like we're going to have some real challenges in the immigration space. How do you start this conversation inside an organization?
No, thanks, Bill. I think, what's important, first is to just get a sense of the body of work that you've got within your organization. I think that's always the first step, is to sort of look at these changes through the lens of, okay, what is this going to mean for us? And I think, HR, whether they're working with an in-house counsel or whether they're working with their external immigration counsel, just first taking that step of saying, okay, well, what's the size of our program? What's our caseload? What do we potentially expect? And I think, as Amy was saying, obviously some of these things are things that are in the future, which will have lots of announcements. But other things, I think, are just things that you can rely on your external, whether it's your external immigration legal partner or your internal immigration legal partner, just in terms of their judgment on what might be happening or how your programs might be affected. I think that's sort of the first step. And then secondly is just getting out there with your stakeholders, identifying who your business leaders are, who are likely to be most impacted by these potential changes, and making sure that these are issues that you're flagging for them so that it's something that can be planned for in the future. So I think sort of the first step is really a lot of analysis with your partners, and then just having a plan together to make sure that you can get the organization potentially ready for what could be coming.
Well, and I'll hit you with a sort of a question. I think immigration can be sort of centrally managed by HR. It can be diffused throughout the organization, and hiring managers may have a much bigger stake in it. And at a time like this, do you have a sense of whether HR should be stepping in and saying, let's really wrap our hands around how we're using these programs and if we're using these programs?
Yeah, I think to the extent you have a decentralized program, I do think that this is a good opportunity to really sort of look at the program as a whole. Like you said, Bill, if you're operating under a situation where you don't sort of have one person looking at things across the board, and you have managers working individually, if that's your structure, I think this can be a great time for HR to look at the issue as a whole and try to understand what potential impacts can be, just so that you're not caught off guard and that you really understand to what extent your company is utilizing legal immigration programs. So I think that is good. To the extent it's already centralized, then I think it's just a matter of the analysis of, okay, what are the types of cases that we have? What do we think could potentially be an impact? And then who are the stakeholders that we just need to make sure are aware?
Excellent, thanks. Now, Amy, there's a lot of immigration in the news. What sorts of things have actually changed that are affecting legal immigration programs?
Well, we all heard the beginning of the Trump administration about the travel ban, and it got rolled out in a very disorganized way, and subsequently has been revised, and still lower courts, circuit courts around the country are holding that it's have issued decisions saying it's not legal. But that will have to be wait to be resolved as to what extent there is going to be a, quote, travel ban. It has some impact, certainly, on legal immigration, in the sense that there are people who are born in those countries, all the affected countries, that come to the United States legally. But I think the two things that are having more of an immediate impact, as far as they're already on the books and their official policies, the DACA rescission and the rescission of TPS, temporary protected status, for a variety of countries. There's over 1 million people right now who are lawfully employed, working for US employers, who hold either the DACA or TPS employment authorization documents, EADs. And when those policies, when the string is run out on those policies, they've announced that DACA is going to expire March 5th, absent congressional action. TPS for the various countries has dates a year or so into the future where it's going to sunset. Employers are going to be in a tough situation because those people that are employed in those classifications, which again, estimates total over 1 million people. There's 1 million jobs. There's got to be replacements of those individuals if the employer is complying with the law. I think some of the things, like you were hinting at earlier, Bill, that have really come to the fore and have like a direct, immediate impact. Although I guess the pending DACA and TPS rescissions are things, in light of what Christy was saying, they're the kinds of issues that HR professionals, might want to talk about in their organization. Do we have TPS or DACA recipients who have EADs, employment authorization documents, and do that kind of assessment that Christy was talking about with regard to, does this actually affect us? It affects, 1 million jobs somewhere in the country. You should check out whether it affects you. But I think the things that are otherwise have gone into effect are in that the 3 Ps, the policies, procedures, and practices, and changes that have been implemented. For example, the USCIS has had on the books a policy memorandum since 2004 that says if an employer gets an approval for a non-immigrant petition, H-1B or L-1, and that employer then files an extension, same employer, same employee, same job, USCIS will give deference to its prior decision. And the end of last year, USCIS rescinded the deference memo. No, we're no longer going to provide deference to the decisions we have made, same employer, same employee, same job. So that's the kind of thing, again, that along the lines of what Christy was suggesting, that employers should take a look at, because you should see how many temporary non-immigrant workers do we employ? Do we regularly seek extensions? It doesn't mean that those extensions are going to be denied. It just means that there are going to be hurdles. The agency is going to look at each case de novo on its own, new, without any reference to the fact that they've already told you it's fine to employ this person. And I think, Bill, there's got to be other 3 Ps, concerns and implementation, that's already you've seen in your practice. That's the kind of thing I think that's really already been occurring right now, mostly in that 3 P area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a lot of discussions around the H-1B visa, because right now it's the time of year when on April 1st we'll be filing the H-1Bs. There has been a discussion in the presidential nominating contest about H-1Bs, the professional sort of the main working type of visa that most people are going to encounter. That April 1st deadline isn't going to change. We still need to be identifying people right now who might need that sponsorship, who have a different kind of employment authorization, whether it's a student visa or perhaps some of these other kinds of employment authorization. We do expect that the number of petitions for these visas is going to be fewer than the number of people who want them and are eligible for them, so that once again there will be probably close to 200,000 petitions filed seeking just 85,000 spots. That really makes a hiring decision difficult when you know that a person's on for example, a student visa, which gives them work permission for either 1 year or 3 years if they have a science degree. And you know that if they hold a master's degree from a U.S. school, probably their chances of getting accepted in the lottery each year are 50 to 65%, sort of very anecdotally. And if they don't have a master's degree from a U.S. school, if they have a bachelor's degree from a U.S. school or a master's degree or a higher degree from somewhere else, they only have about a 35% chance, about a third is what we see in terms of the getting selected. So, that has an impact on, what are you going to do with this employee if they're in your organization for a year or two and then can't continue because of the H-1B cap? That's certainly going to continue to be a problem. Based on the current administration, alleviating that problem by making more visas available is not likely to be a solution anytime in the near future. So for this year, we're talking about, does it make sense to kind of file a minimally qualifying petition in order to be in this H-1B lottery? What we saw last year was the Immigration Service asking for enormous amounts of evidence about the H-1B visas that were filed, asking for evidence of the level of responsibility that the position was going to have, asking for evidence that there was enough work for the person to do. I mean, I received these requests, prove that there is enough work for you to do at your company for, household name companies that we work with, and we just sort of wanted to tell people, do a Google search, right? I mean, this company probably provides something that you use on a daily basis and has, over 40,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 employees, right? Yeah, there's enough work for this person to do. I think that means that you also have to set appropriate expectations with managers, that if they're hiring someone who has any kind of temporary work authorization, who needs any kind of sponsorship, that the company is not going to be in control 100% of whether this is successful or not, just because it is a random lottery. And have that conversation with the manager. What's the backup plan if this person cannot extend their working visa? What's the backup plan if this person who's on an H-1B can't renew it because of the lack of deference to the fact that we've had them on an H-1B? I think really sort of taking this opportunity to take a step back and say, is our hiring and onboarding process where we, how soon in this process do we learn about the need for sponsorship? And are we making intentional decisions about whom we sponsor, whether that is initial hires for new folks coming out of school, whether that's a conversion of contractors as we make staffing decisions to not use contract labor but to bring people in-house. All of those kinds of things should be made with the immigration needs of the candidate in mind. Some of the sort of areas of questions, what is a specialty occupation? That's the legal standard to be an H-1B. We're seeing the Immigration Service push back on whether financial analysts can even be sponsored for H-1Bs, whether computer science positions can be sponsored for people who have H-1Bs, particularly whether people who have a different degree than the specific field that they're going into. If you're a person who's going into a big data kind of position, but the title of your degree is an engineering degree, you may be extremely qualified for that job, but the Immigration Service may question whether or not you can be given an H-1B because of that. We're also seeing that the Immigration Service is doing the Department of Labor's job. So rather than leaving the question of whether the employer has correctly categorized this job and correctly is offering a prevailing wage, that is supposed to, under the statute, be the Department of Labor's job. But now the Immigration Service is asking questions about it and is asking employers to prove that they've correctly classified these jobs. So, a couple of those occupations I mentioned are becoming quite problematic. And this is, I think this is where we are seeing this sort of change in personnel, allowing or sending the message throughout the organization that yes, it is appropriate for you to be questioning even large everyday name, household name companies about their use of the H-1B program. So I think in this area, Christy, I want to pull you back in. How do you sort of begin to get a handle around this process as an HR person? Sort of what when someone comes to you and says, where do we even start with having these conversations?
Yeah, and I think it's important, just going back to that idea of looking at your internal process for handling cases, is to just revisit when is the right time to have the conversation about the strategy for a particular hire or a particular set of filings that you're going to need to anticipate that you're going to need to make. And what I think is really one of the best things you can do is to have that conversation at the very start and come up with a strategy for what you expect sponsorship will need, when you will expect that to happen, what the cost is going to be, and then if there's going to be some potential unpredictability, what is the plan in the case that something like that were to occur? And having that discussion early, having obviously HR as part of that discussion, but also hiring managers or department heads, and just making sure that inside the company there's a common understanding about what it's going to take to handle these cases and what the commitment is going to be. You mentioned, Bill, a certain amount of information being provided. That's something that internally you have to sign on and make the commitment to do. In addition, it's not simply a matter of retaining your outside counsel, or it's not simply a matter of the cost. It's a matter of the administration and the effort and who's going to be responsible for that, and sort of who's part of the team who's going to be supporting these cases. And I think that in times when you're being prepared for some sort of unpredictability, all of those very, I think, basic elements of working together inside of an organization really, need to be in place, and everyone needs to be clear on their roles so that things can go smoothly, and that if unanticipated things happen, then you're able to deal with that in a way that, that will help as much as possible to keep things going smoothly.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot with one specific kind of everyday change. A lot of us have a sort of a base of work that already exists because of past hiring decisions. We're filing things, and we're getting asked for more and more documentation. This idea that I presented of everything being questioned, and really the Immigration Service not being satisfied with a letter from the HR person who says this person will be employed, as a systems analyst working on this project. End of story. The Immigration Service is saying, well, we don't know that they're a systems analyst, so you have to give us your organization charts, and you have to give us payroll documentation, you have to give us resumes of other people who do this job, and you have to maybe give us proprietary work product that this person has worked on, so we'll then judge whether you're telling us the truth about what the person's job is. What do you do when a manager tells HR, you're crazy, we're not going to give all this information to the government, this is our secret sauce here, this is our business?
Right. No, I mean, that's a very real issue, Bill. And I think, at the end of the day, obviously, it's always a judgment call. But the important thing, I think, when you're having that conversation is to make sure you have your internal subject matter expert weighing in on the nature of the information that the company is considering providing. Because for so many companies, right, that issue of proprietary information is a very, very significant one. And, there's potential ways that you can try to deal with that. I mean, if, for example, there's a document that needs to be produced, but it has very proprietary information on it, you can work with your outside legal counsel and consider redacting, part of that information, marking it as redacted, explaining why it's redacted, trying to come up with ways to provide information that won't disclose something that perhaps is, it's not relevant to the question that's being asked, but that, for example, maybe one document has the proprietary information, but you can answer the question that's being asked with another piece of information that's just as good. It just doesn't have that proprietary information. But that it's important to remember all of that is a certain amount of work internally in an organization, right? And it's work that has to be completed by deadlines. So having your team together, making sure you understand who the subject matter expert is, making sure that person knows that they're going to need to devote a certain amount of time to making sure that the company can provide what's necessary, but also taking the time to do it carefully so that it watches out for issues such like proprietary information. It's really important.
Hey, Bill, this is Amy. I just wanted to add something to what you and Christy are talking about, or to emphasize a point. There's a really important connection here. So the lawyers like Bill, who are dealing on a day-to-day basis with these cases and trying to identify what are the legal issues that are being presented by the agency's new approach, and the client, the employer who is sponsoring the worker, obviously both want the same thing. They want to be able to obtain an H-1B approval authorizing the employer to be able to lawfully hire or continue to employ this the particular, the named foreign-born professional worker. And I think that one of the keys to that is, instead of the employer being presented a list of documents and information, you have to have that subject matter expert, the person that Christy is emphasizing for our listeners to, make sure you know who that person is and have them involved. Really ask the lawyer, at this time, lawyer, what is it that you're trying to prove? Like, explain it to me, not just telling me a list of 12 documents, but what is it that's the issue that you think is the way for us to navigate this process? Because I think if the employer understands what it is that the lawyer is seeking, what the lawyer's strategy is, what the lawyer thinks is the way to navigate the agency's current approach, and it's changing all the time, more cases get resolved and sort of that understanding is fine-tuned, then the better the employer is positioned to actually think of what are those documents that we have or that we can redact that address that, or something that maybe the lawyer hasn't thought of as the way to prove the issue. So I think this kind of communication between the HR professional as the coordinator for the employer and the actual subject matter expert, the business person on the employer side and the lawyer, is really important as a key, more important than ever, as a key way to navigate the current environment.
And I think, too, the other, cultural, strategic kind of question that has to get asked within the organization, and a conversation that has to be mediated by HR, is to say, where are we going to push back here? Are we, the burden in immigration proceedings is supposed to be, relatively low. For decades, the Immigration Service was happy with the human resources person saying, here's what's going on in our organization. This is under oath, believe me. And now to ask for all this stuff, should employers be sort of putting the Immigration Service on the spot and saying, look, what we've given you is good enough, and we've given you more than enough to establish that this person's entitled to the visa that they have, so we think you should give it to us. The risk there is the Immigration Service says, no, we don't agree, it's not enough. But I think that employers are increasingly going to be having to decide that they are going to be willing to go so far but not farther in terms of the documentation request, and trying to decide, like, is the risk of denial more important than, for example, protecting this information? All right, well, we got a couple of things that we want to do some quick hits on. So the employment authorization documents, we mentioned those before, ending DACA, won't be renewing TPS. Sort of what do you expect coming around in terms of further regulations that we'll see from this administration?
Well, I want to just be brief here because I want to make sure we have time to get through the various points, like you said, that we want to hit on and allow time for questions. So I'll just say that if we're looking at the slide about what the future may hold, for our listeners to kind of make some quick notes. The H-4 work authorization, the H-4 employment authorization document rule, is expected to be rescinded by this administration. They have not yet published a proposal to do so. They will have to go through notice and comment rulemaking to do that. And we expect that proposal to be published soon. It would take another at least 6 or 7 months after it is published before they could issue the final rule. And I know one of the things that we're going to talk about to sort of end our presentation is what's the role that employers can play in trying to address any of these what the future might hold issues. And I think that's worth discussing, at least briefly, to touch on the idea that employers should be assessing, as Christy was saying, which of these things affect them, and then participating in the rulemaking process, because it's something that employers typically do not do. and will have a big impact on the agency's ability to finalize the rule or others to challenge it in court if there's actually an administrative record where stakeholders say, no, that doesn't work for us. So the two things about employment authorization documents that we expect regarding rulemaking are rescind the H-4 spousal work authorization rule and revise the current program rules on optional practical training and the STEM OPT extension of post-completion work authorization. And then the agency has also stated in its unified agenda that it expects to have 3 rules that it believes are critical to implementing the BAHA executive order, the Buy American, Hire American executive order. One is to revise the definition of specialty occupation. And some might ask, apropos of Bill's last point about employers making decisions about how much information they're going to provide and when they're going to push back, how can the agency first start asking more information and requiring further information and further evidence about what is a specialty occupation before they change the regulation? There's also talk about they're evaluating whether and how to have a rule that requires employers to register each year for the H-1B lottery in the expectation that there's going to continue to be one unless Congress increases the numbers. And that's a rule that really should be seen as an operational change that is for the advantage of USCIS. It's not something that is going to help employers. It's not designed. The idea behind it is not to make things easier for employers. USCIS proposed a rule like this in 2011, and the business community roundly criticized it, and it was never finalized. They're talking about coming back with a proposal regarding that, which could also change your timelines for when you have to get your information together and whatnot. And there's also talk about actually having a rulemaking that would restrict essentially who can be a qualifying employer, what is a qualifying employee for H-1B purposes. And I think the concept of whether there should be either restrictions on L-1B specialized knowledge workers or prevailing wage requirements in L-1 is also something that's out there. So those are things that are, those are issues that are being assessed. And I think it's important to note, though, sort of bringing us back to the 3 Ps, policies, procedures, and practices. These are all things that are on the table. The only one that has made, where the policy decision makers have made all required decisions and the rule is about ready to go, is the H-4 employment authorization document rule. All of these other rules, they're in the mix, they're being worked on, but they are not close to being published. That doesn't mean they're not going to happen and that it's not very important to be aware of them, and it's not very important to be thinking now and planning now about what could be coming down the pike. But like this slide is entitled, it's what the future might hold, and those things are relevant as you're assessing what your HR function is and how to position yourself now so that you're ready to deal with what the future might hold.
Christy, let me just ask you a quick question. I know we've done some I-9 audit work together. It's never very fun to have to go through the I-9s, but if leadership comes to HR and says, well, we've heard DOC is going away, CPS is going away, F1 OPT might be going away, H4 EADs might be going away. What's our exposure? How would you begin to answer that question?
I mean, one possibility is doing an audit, I-9 audit, to look at temporary employment authorization dates, looking at your EADs and trying to get a sense, of how you could be impacted. Obviously, that's a commitment of time and process that the company would need to make. But I think that's one possibility. And then I think also just trying to, even though it may be difficult to get your arms around what your exact impact is, just thinking about what are your contingency plans in the event that something like this does occur. and what's your backup plan? Talk about it now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the specific thing, that I think a lot of times employers usually are tracking, oftentimes electronically, that a person has temporary work authorization, but they're not tracking what kind of work authorization it is, and having to actually pull I-9s and look for, who's got the code on that temporary employment authorization, which says they're an H4 EAD, for example. And I think it's important to remember that this is not an issue just for production workers or warehouse workers or, agricultural workers. This is an issue that may affect professional workers, recent college graduates who may have presented their ability to work to the organization, based on one of these programs. And because they had independent work authorization, the organization never questioned whether they needed any kind of sponsorship or what their immigration situation was. So it's an opportunity to, get hands around something and begin to have a conversation about what we're going to do and how many people are impacted by it. So let's just, we hear so much about merit-based immigration. How should we understand that, Amy?
Well, just really briefly, again, because I know we have a lot of things to talk about or that we could talk about, and we want to be brief to make sure that we allow some time for people to ask questions. I would say merit-based immigration, the idea of merit-based immigration is that a larger percentage of the annual new lawful permanent residents coming to the United States should be based on skills and what work the individual is going to do and bring to the United States economy. That's the concept. There's some general consensus that makes a lot of sense, certainly in the employer community. But I think it's important to realize and to make sure that we're clear, the proposals that have come from the Trump administration thus far do not increase merit-based immigrant numbers to the United States, even by one immigrant. The proposals instead are all about eliminating or reducing other immigration pipelines, family-based immigration, refugees, question why it is that what our country does about people who are fleeing persecution has anything to do with the merit-based immigration discussion, but nevertheless, reducing refugee numbers, reducing family-based immigration numbers, eliminating the diversity visa lottery numbers, and by reducing other immigrant flows, theoretically, the ratio of merit-based immigrants has just risen, but they're not talking about in any way increasing the number of merit-based immigrants, just reducing other numbers. And then one last quick point about merit-based immigration, and I'll just touch on trusted employer. The merit-based immigration ideas that have been put forward by the Trump administration also come with it an idea, a presumption that an employer-led or employer-driven system where employers decide who they want to hire and that identifies who has the merit to make contributions to our economy is rejected. The Trump administration view is there should be a point system because, quote, other countries do it. But the point system that they proposed, I think it's Time Magazine put out a little points calculator, and employers who sponsor people for green cards put in the credentials of their sponsored employees, and they find out that frequently they don't qualify. And that's because the point system that's been proposed does not reflect or focus on business need. And the other countries that we're supposedly mimicking, like Australia or Canada, they have very different uses for the point system. They actually, for example, in Canada, 80% of all immigrants to Canada go to Montreal, Vancouver, or Toronto. So it's pretty easy to come up with a point system that would reflect the economic needs of those three large metropolitan areas. In the United States, I think the Brookings Institution has said that immigrants go to 109 different metropolitan areas, and there's no way to come up with one point system that will reflect the different needs of our country. We have a big country with a lot of different economic models and regional regionally interactive models of economic activity. Like in Philadelphia, you have Philadelphia, New Jersey, Delaware, and their point system chooses the immigrants who would come to be based in Philadelphia based solely on the certain criteria in the Pennsylvania economy. So merit-based immigration is a phrase that indicates we should choose more immigrants based on merit, but none of the Trump proposals actually do that. The trusted employer concept is something that relates, I guess, to two things. One is, why should employers have to keep providing the same information over and over again? And that element seems to have a lot of backing. And under the Obama administration, they started a pilot program to try to address that or to try to test that out. I don't think it's gotten very far, but it's something that operationally would make a lot of sense for the agency and also would make a difference to employers. So it seems like something that could be pushed. And I guess the other part of trusted employer is that certain employers, if they took certain steps, like allowing audits and whatnot, should be, quote, trusted and have a different path in their filing and having their petitions adjudicated. And I haven't heard any interest whatsoever in this administration at the agency level of pursuing that second aspect, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that, it still is something that I know people care about, and that, certainly legislatively could be part of proposals to study it and figure out how to address that.
Thanks. And obviously this administration is not looking for ways to make things easier for employers. Seems to be a theme here. Yeah. So Christy, you're having this conversation internally. How do you move this forward?
I think, I think especially in light of all of these potential changes, but also just as a best practice, if you're having this conversation internally, taking this opportunity, if you don't already, to establish some processes and to get internal alignment on what your processes are and what your guidelines are when you're looking to sponsor employees for immigration, whether it's on a visa, whether you're sponsoring a green card. I think as a really best practice is figuring out who are the key individuals inside the organization who need to weigh in on these decisions. What are your general guidelines for how you're going to approach this? What type of positions are you going to be considering sponsorship for? Also, I think getting clarity on the budget, right? Talking to your external immigration counsel with respect to, okay, well, what are all of these potential changes, whether it be in the law or regulations or in practices, going to mean for what we need to file and what the cost of that is going to be, and making sure that you're including that information, when you're discussing with the business, if, the business leaders are the ones who are paying for the work from their budget. So sort of understanding the budget, understanding the effect on the budget. And then also, I think as part of developing that set of internal guidelines or practices on how you're going to handle immigration matters, it's a good practice when you identify those key partners, to think about whether it makes sense to have really an official touch base on any particular immigration case when it's beginning. So that's a time that you can align with the different partners, whether it be the HR partner or the hiring manager or the next level manager or the department head, as to what is going to be required from the team in order to handle the immigration work that needs to be done. We talked about that issue of needing to provide information and who's going to be the subject matter expert. That sort of being able to have that communication in the context of an established framework of guidelines that you've developed, I think can be very helpful and can help you, navigate periods of potential uncertainty.
Thanks, Christy. And I think, the other thing I will just throw out there, Amy mentioned it before, there is this possibility where businesses can be parts of the comments on the regulatory process. If we don't like it, if we don't think our organization is going to be helped by it, we have a voice and can say that. So I think whether our organization does or whether we put together a coalition or act, in some of our Delaware Valley workforce improvement, for example, might be willing to speak speak on behalf of employers, this will be an opportunity for businesses to get involved and to defend the programs that we rely on. So, look, this is uncertain times. I think HR may feel like it's a bit left out on alone, but on the other hand, I think HR is uniquely positioned to articulate how important these immigration programs are to staffing, to getting work done in some important areas of our organization. So, would encourage all of you to to begin to follow up by thinking about who are these folks, how are they important, how are we going to defend our ability to continue to sponsor them in these uncertain times. So, thanks very much. That'll wrap up our presentation today.
Okay, we will now open it up for questions. If you do have a question for any of our speakers, please type it into the question box at this time.
And while we're waiting for questions, I'll just note that I've put up a slide with our contact information. If any of the ideas here that were discussed are of interest, you need a follow-up to them, here is the contact information for it. And I know these slides will also be circulated once this program is over.
It looks like we don't have any questions at this time. Like Bill said, if you do have any questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out at info@phillyshrm.com, or you can also reach out to any of the speakers. And I'm going to hand it over to Erica to wrap up today's webinar.
Oh, Erica, I don't see your phone on. Lindsay, I don't know if you want to do the wrap up.
Sure. So thank you again to today's speakers for taking the time to share their knowledge with us. Thank you to each of you for joining us for today's webinar. As a reminder, please look for the follow-up email with the link to the survey. Be sure to complete the survey in order to receive HRCI and SHRM credits, and visit www.phillyshrm.org to register for other upcoming events. We encourage you to check out the Philly SHRM website for updates on all of our upcoming programs. Our next webinar on why moving from policy to practice is in the best interest of your LGBTQ employees and their allies will be held on April 12th. Also, make sure to register for the annual symposium. On behalf of Philly SHRM, thanks again and enjoy your afternoon.